Hello everyone and welcome to today's webinar. Thanks for joining us for By the Numbers, the second in our series on women in agriculture across the U.S. For today, we have some special guest speakers with us to help us understand this topic about the census, what the Census of Agriculture tells us about women and farm and ranch operators. We have Virginia Harris with the National Agricultural Statistical Service, and we also have Carolyn Sachs with Penn State. She's a professor there with Women's Studies, and Lyn Garling, a farmer from Pennsylvania. So thank you, ladies, for joining us and helping us understand more about women in agriculture.
Thanks for having us.
Well, you're welcome. So I want to remind our audience that you are welcome to type questions into the chat box at any time. Once we are go through our presentation today, we'll be bringing those questions out, and I'll be helping to bring those questions forward to our guest speakers. But go ahead and type them in at any time that you like. You can also type in other comments. Those that are joining us, it's great that you're able to take some time out of your day and Iowa and Bonnie from New we do get to know you through our webinars and through our Carolyn to introduce this topic to us.
Today, I'm just going to lead us out. This most recent data, which is the 2011 date, counted in this census compared to be earlier, because to that. So we only know how many women farmers there were beginning in 1960. It's declined, and we're not quite sure why. So we're really looking to Ginger to help blip on the screen. Oops. Smaller farms and ranches in terms of the number of they also raise different products than men's farms. Or other partners, so that's something that we'll get into in more detail too. Quite a bit about this, and we're wondering, how women tell us about that. And So, for example, during the economic and middle-sized farms during that time period, but what is it about of us are educators and work with women farmers, and some of us work with government programs. So what I'd like us to come away with at the end of our webinar today, and as we look at this data and trends that Ginger's going to show us, and she's got quite a bit to show us, but some of the big takeaway questions to me are, given this data, what types of educational programs do women farmers need? What government support programs could help women farmers? Would it be things like conservation easement, conservation reserve, commodity programs, or new and beginning farmer programs? And finally, what can we say about the future of women farm operators? I'm optimistic that the next census is going to have more women farm operators, but I guess we can't really say that from this, but sort of project on to where we go from here. So that's what I have for today, and so now Ginger is going to show us all the numbers she's crunched.
Thank you so much, Carolyn. We really appreciate that introduction to the statistics. So next I'll introduce Ginger with the National Ag Statistics Service, and we are just so fortunate to have her with us for this webinar today. She's a wealth of information, just a very knowledgeable researcher. Now, her job specifically with NASS is really working with the demographic data. And so that means she works a lot with the data with women, beginning farmers, different ethnic groups, and so forth. So this is really one of her areas of expertise. Just a little background on Ginger. She grew up near Chicago, as did I, so we have that in common, Ginger. And then she headed off to college, and then she did some time with the Peace Corps, where she really traveled around the world and really gained a greater understanding of women's role in agriculture around the world. So kind of really helped her be more interested in this whole topic of women in agriculture. And so she tells me that she really enjoys this 5-year cycle of the census, and so that's kind of neat. We always are looking forward to the census data coming out every 5 years. So without further ado, Ginger, I will turn it over to you, and thanks again for being here with us today.
Well, I'm always happy to talk to people about the census data. You know, the more people that use the census data, the more support we have for the census programs. So thanks for everyone who's attending. I'm just going to start with a little brief background on what NASS is, the organization I work for. It's part of the Department of Agriculture, and we're responsible for data collection about crops and livestock. We produce many reports on an annual basis on production, inventory, value, and demographics. You know, we've been collecting data on the corn harvest, you know, the record harvest, and then every 5 years we conduct a census of agriculture. What's the census? Well, we mail out about 3 million report forms, and the most recent census covers the 2012 calendar year. We published it in just this year in 2014. So we collect data for about half a year, we analyze the data, and then we publish it. So the thing about the census and its use and its importance to agriculture is it's a complete count every 5 years of all American farms and ranches. It's the most complete ag data source available, and it's the only one that has data for every single county in the United States that has a farm. It includes information on land use, production practices, income and expenses, and most importantly, for the thing we're talking about today, it's the primary source of data on the demographics of America's farm operators. So that's where we get the counts of women, because any group that's smaller than, women are about 14% of the U.S. Principal farm operators. Some of that data is hard to get in sample surveys. So the census is really a wonderful tool to look at analyzing data on different groups. How do you get counted? Well, this is one of the things that people often ask. The definition the census uses to collect a farm is it's any place from which $1,000 of agricultural products were produced and sold or normally were produced and sold during the census year, and government payments are included in that $1,000. So basically, a place is counted as a farm. It can be very, very small. That's one cow or a couple of horses. So you don't have to be very big to be counted as a farm. And if you think you weren't counted on the last census, we actually have a place where you can sign up on our website to be included on the next mail list for the 2017 Census of Agriculture. The census data is used by a variety of people, by farmers and ranchers, rural communities, federal, state, and local governments, trade associations, agribusinesses. There's a variety of things people can use with the census data. They can make decisions about how their operation fits in the whole agricultural economy. Companies can use the data to target markets. Community planners can use the information to provide programs for rural residents. And legislators use the numbers from the census when shaping farm policies and programs. But one of the things that is true about the data is we will never identify any individual farm's data. The data from the census is all aggregate numbers, and we have a strong confidentiality pledge that no individual data will be revealed. It's not subject to Freedom of Information Acts. It's a statistical data source, and only statistical aggregates can be released. So just a little bit of background before we go into the specifics on women farmers about what are the trends in all farm numbers. Well, the number of farms in general has been going down. If we look back to 1982, we started off with about 2.5 million farms. The 2012 census counted about 2.1 million farms. So there's been a steady decline, a few ups and a few downs, but it's pretty much stabilized. From, if we go further back in time, you'll see a real long decline in numbers, but generally it's become a much more stable number with a few ups and downs. The census numbers are adjusted for incompleteness of the mail list, for non-response, and for misclassification. And for the statisticians out there, we have a statistical appendix that explains the methodology and some of the adjustment procedures. Alongside the number of farms, land has also been declining. The last census we saw, I think it was about 7.6 million acres less land and farms. Land and farms is not just cropland, it's also pasture land, idle cropland, crop that failed. So even though the 2012 Census of Agriculture covered a drought year over much of the U.S., that land is still counted as being in agricultural production. And now on to the subject you guys, I'm sure, want to hear about women farm operators. The census has a lot of numbers, and sometimes they're a little bit confusing because they're very similar but a little different, and so we get questions. So one of the things I want to do is explain some of the concepts. I may have to go back and forth on a slide because sometimes a visual explanation seems to work best. As Carolyn said, women farm operators we only started counting the group as a group in 1978. Prior to that, we would have counted women farm operators, but they would not have been identifiable in the census data. Until the 2002 Census of Agriculture, we collected demographic data for just one operator per farm, and we asked for the senior partner. Respondents would have decided themselves who was the person they wanted to report. And prior to 2002, we did not adjust for census mail list coverage. In 2012, we added an additional question about family relationships on the farm. In particular, we asked about whether these multiple operators, the second and third in particular, were spouses of the principal operator. One of the things people ask us is, well, how do you know if you're counting all the women, or how do you know who you're getting reported? Well, for the demographics, we're pretty much relying on self-reports. So we're counting on respondents to identify themselves as male or female, what their race is, how long they've been on the farm. So to get to the specific numbers, this is a little snapshot of the census report form and exactly how we collect the data on farm operators and numbers. So we have a section of the report form towards the back, and we ask for, you'll excuse me if you can't see the picture, but we ask for the total number of operators, and then we say, of that number, how many of them are women? So that's the total operator number and the total women operator number. And then we go ahead and we ask for detailed demographic data on up to 3 operators per farm. So the first column is labeled principal operator or senior partner, and then operator 2 and operator 3. And then the way we get the statistics on women is we ask for the sex of the operator, male or female, for each of those 3 operators. And then the numbers are tabulated according to what the respondent put in each of those 3 columns. So those are the numbers we're looking at, that total number, and then what was reported in each of those 3 columns, and then the tabulations we derive from those numbers. So to go to the highlights, in 2012, we counted about 3.2 million total operators. That's that one big number. How many operators are on this farm? That was about a 3% decrease from 2007. For that total women operator number, we counted 991,000 total women operators, which is about 30% of the total. That was down about 2% from 2007. Then if we look at that up to 3 operators number, the ones for whom we have detailed data, we counted about 970,000 women operators, and that is about 98% of the total. So we have detailed demographic data on basically everyone. Then we can also look at it in terms of just the principal operator. So that's what's the number that's saying who is the senior partner, the person in charge. And it's whoever is designated by the person completing the census form. This principal operator number equals the number of farms. So there were 2.1 million farms in 2012. Of those farms, 288,264 had a woman principal operators. While overall the number of principal operators was down 4%, the number of women operators was down 6%. However, if we look at, we do publish measures of standard error associated with each of the numbers in the census. The 4% was actually statistically significant. The 6% was not, which could mean it's just a blip in the numbers, or it could mean it was actually down 6%. What about those other operators? Well, that's one of the things that we learned when we started asking about the multiple people involved on the farm operation. That's when we really started counting a lot more women involved in agriculture. We know that of the farms, there were about many of those second operators, 626,000 of them were female operators. That new question we added in 2012 about the spousal relationship said that about 570,000 of them were the spouse of the principal operator. So we have a lot of farms that are run by families, which I know is not a surprise to anyone involved in this field. One of the things that we didn't know is men are reported as second operators as well, and some of them are also spouses of the principal operator. That would mean a woman farming with a man and the woman was listed first. So it's not always the case that the male is automatically reported as the principal operator. we also have the same data for the third column. About 55,000 women were reported as a third operator. And again, some of those were spouses of the principal operator. So one of the things that we always like to do when we look at the numbers is to look at them in context. So this chart is showing you back to the first time we collected the data in 1978. There were actually 113,000 women female operators counted in 1978. In 2012, again, we had 288,000 women operators. That's an increase of 156% over that same data period. So what does that 6% mean? Is it a blip, or is it something that's telling us about a change in women farm operators? Well, farms overall decreased during that period. What's happening? Well, we know that in particular the number of small farms decreased. Women are more likely to have small farms. So some of those trends, some of those data points make sense with each other. The census, there's two numbers for 1997, and that's showing the importance of adjusting the census data for the incompleteness of the male list. When we did that, we really found that women, if we just looked at the male list, were not counted as much because they tend to operate the kind of farms that are not necessarily on the census male list. They're small farms, they're cattle farms, they're horse farms. They're less likely to have crop farms. Then we can look at the data not just at the U.S. level, which these numbers are, but also at a regional basis. While the number of farm operators and female principal operators declined, it wasn't overall in the U.S. In fact, it was mostly in the Midwest and on the Pacific Coast. Areas in New England and in the Southwest and Texas saw increases in the number of female operators. So again, the trends weren't constant across the U.S. And when you look at the all farm number, a lot of those similar trends are found. We had a large decrease in the number of farms in the Southeast and in some places in the Midwest, and more farms in New England and the Southwest. So then one of the things that we always like to look at is, since the census is conducted down to the county level, where are those female operators? This is probably a map that you might not be able to see too well on your computer screen, but one dot represents 20 female operators. So it's showing you the distribution of female principal operators. You can see there are a lot in the Midwest, in Texas, and on the coast. You can look at the numbers. Let's see if my next slide will advance. In a slightly different way as well. You can say not only where are the women operators, but where are the women operators making up a larger share of all operators. While the Midwest has perhaps a larger number of women operators, the share of women operators is greater in the New England states and in Florida, basically on the coast, including in Alaska and Hawaii. In fact, the share of women principal operators varies across the United States. It's up from a high of 39% of all operators in Arizona are female, and only 7% are in South Dakota. The numbers really are lowest in the Midwest as a share of the total. There are 5 states, Illinois, Minnesota, Nebraska, and Iowa, and South Dakota, where fewer than 10% of all principal operators are female. The U.S. average is 14%. Then we can look at not just women who are counted as the principal operator on their farm, but as all operators on the farm. And that's really where you see a larger number of women in the Midwest. You can see there are female farmers everywhere in the U.S., in every county, and that they make up a significant share of the farm population. 31% of all operators in the farm operators in the U.S. are female. And again, the similar patterns do hold. 45% of all operators in Arizona are female, And the fewest number as a share of the total operator number is 23% in Illinois. So then we can look at
Ginger, I'd like to interrupt just for a question in a moment, because it seems like it might be important to future understanding. So we did have a question from Heather about, when you were talking about adjusting the list for errors and non-inclusion, what did you mean about that? What did you mean that they weren't likely on a mail list? Can you explain that a little more?
Well, starting in the 2002 census, and we backdated to 1997, there are three components of adjustment for the census numbers. One is for mail list incompleteness, one is for non-response, and one is for misclassification. So NASS conducts something called the June Area Survey, and that's where we come up with the number of corn acres in the U.S. So that's a land-based sample. So we go out throughout the entire U.S. to a sample of land area, and then we interview the person who's operating that piece of farmland or ranch land. And then we get the demographic characteristics of that person. So one of the things that we know is we can measure, once we go out and talk to that person, we say, are you on our mail list for the census? And it's actually not necessarily a mail list as you think is with an advertising company, but it's the sample frame for the census. So we say, are you on the possibility of basically, do you have a possibility of receiving the census form or not? So we know that there are characteristics that make you less likely to be on that census mail list. So we know we're missing X number of people. And that's how what we're talking about when we're talking about adjusting for incompleteness of the mail list. We have two independent sources of data, so we're adding them together to get the best estimate of the number of farms and ranches and farm operators as well.
Thank you for explaining that, Ginger.
You're welcome. So when we talk about demographic changes, the census contains a variety of demographic data. It talks about age, whether you live on your farm or not, how long you've been farming, and also the race, ethnicity, and gender. And so we look at trends across all the characteristics of farm operators. And some of the major changes we've seen since 2007 is we did see fewer female operators, but more minority operators who are Hispanic, Black, Asian, American, Indian. We saw the average age of farm operators continues to increase. Excuse me. We saw fewer beginning operators. We saw fewer small farms. But we did see more people reporting farming as their primary occupation. So all those pieces of data, they don't tell one story, but what you do when you're looking at the data is you're trying to piece it together and say, are there multiple data points that will allow me to explain trends in agriculture? We do have fewer small farms, but we have more people reporting farming as their primary occupation. Well, that could be a good thing. There's more people who are relying on the farm as their primary source of income. One of the things that we look at, we can also see what types of farms are increasing, not just size, but what kind of commodities they produce. That's another thing that lets us tell this complete story of women on the farm. Overall, from 2007 to 2012 for women, most of the changes in these various demographic categories mirror those from farms overall. Women got older, more women reported farming as their primary occupation. There were fewer small farms, more big farms. But some of the ones that were particular for women-operated farms is there was a large decrease of women-operated farms that participated in the Conservation Reserve Program. And some of those farms may have been entirely in the Conservation Reserve Program. That's how they were defined as a farm. So maybe that's one explanation for the lower number of female-operated farms. And then we look at what sectors were up and down. And this is one where female and male operated farms differed. The sectors with growth in the census a lot of the sectors just overall in the agricultural economy decreased. Some sectors with growth were grains and oilseeds, vegetables, and sheep and goats. Now, if we look at just those first two, grains and oilseeds, that's historically a fairly male-dominated field. Over 95% of the grain and oilseed farms have a male principal operator. That's less true for vegetable farms and sheep and goat farms. While overall, there was a 10% increase in grain and oilseed farms operated, women-operated grain and oilseed farms only increased 1%. So some of the overall changes in the agricultural sector were not favoring in terms of, well, grain and oilseed prices were high, so more people operated grain and oilseed farms. Women tended to participate less in that sector, so they weren't participating in that sector growth necessarily as much. With vegetable farms, that was another sector for growth, but that's where the number of female operated farms in that category increased by 25%. So that's a big change. But some of the sectors with big losses were in cattle production, basically a lot of the livestock specialties. So then this is the point where we're getting into quite a few details. And what we're trying to do is explain what's happening. Why are the number of farms changing, and what are the particular kinds of farms that are changing? Well, one of the things that we know is women farm operators tend to be older than all farm operators. The average age of female operators is 60.1, which is almost 2 years older than the average for all. But then we saw in this census there was actually a decline in the number of female-operated farms where the female farm operator was 75 and over. This didn't occur with all farms. So that's probably some portion of the answer is to the decline of female farm operators. Those very oldest farm operators probably did retire during this past census cycle. One of the ways we can look at age is look at it over time. This is probably a graph that's going to make your eyes glaze over, and you might want to look at it more closely when we post the presentation, is that we can look at trends in aging, excuse my cough, over time. And while we see that men have aged fairly rapidly over time, female farm operators have not aged as rapidly, that we do have a pretty significant growth in younger farm operators. Let's talk a little bit more about the farms women operate. Again, we said, excuse me, there's 288,000 farms with a woman principal operator. But there are many more farms that have women involved. There's almost 1 million farms with women. But what's happening with those farms? What are those female-operated farms doing? Well, they're selling a lot of products. Women female principal operators. I have a catch in my throat, so you'll all have to excuse me. There were women principal farm operators sold about $13 billion in agricultural products in 2012. That's out of the $395 billion sold by the entire farm sector. Women principal operators tend to be less involved in crop production than in livestock production, and they sell less on average per farm. When we look at women as commercial farm operators, one of the things that we do see is that larger size farms grew for women principal operators in almost every size category above the very smallest. So every size category of farm above $2,500 in sales grew for women farm operators. We see a decrease in the very lowest, those that are so-called point farms, where they may not have sold any product in the census year. And that's really where we saw the largest decrease and female farm operators. So it wasn't really in the commercial size farms, it's in these farms that are selling, in general, very few products. If we look at it for farms that had any women operator, we see very similar trends. Again, it's the larger size farms that are increasing and the very smallest that saw the biggest decrease. For educators, I'm getting lost in my slides, give me a second. If we want to look at how male and female farms compare, one of the things that we do know is that female farm operators are much more likely to have a very small farm. Almost 45% of the women farm operators sold less than $1,000 in agricultural products during the census year. That compares to only about 25% of male-operated farms. Male-operated farms are much more likely to be in these largest size categories of, you know, 50,000 or more in agricultural product sales. And the same general trend is true for farms where any operator is a woman. Male farms with no women operators do tend to be larger. What are women actually producing and selling? Well, this is a graph that's showing you what the sales were, how many farms had sales in a given area, and how many farms there were. So just to show you at the very top, if we look at the total sales by women, poultry and eggs dominated. About 30% of the total sales from female-operated farms, actually about 22%, excuse me, were from poultry and eggs. But only a little less than 10% of women-operated farms had that commodity. You can see other things where the number of farms that had the item were higher, but the actual sales were lower. For example, crops, other crops than hay, you know, 15% of women-operated farms sold hay, but that's only about 5% or less of the total sales from these farms. So there's a difference in what most farms are producing and where the dollars of value are coming. What do women-operated farms look like in terms of acres? Well, it pretty much matches the dollar distribution. Women are much more likely to have very small acres, 1 to 9, 10 to 49, and are less likely to have very large operations with 500 or more acres. The census contains a lot of data. One of the things we can do is look at the income and expense statement for women to see how they're doing. Are they generating a profit? While they sold about $13 billion in 2012, they received about $500 million in government payments. They also had money from farm-related income, which includes things like cash rent of farmland if they didn't operate all the land they own. But they also had a large amount of expenses on those farms. So on average, while women sold about $45,000 in product, their net profit was, in terms of the cash flow, was only about $4,500 in 2012. And one of the things that might be of concern is that's actually lower than in 2007, where for all farms it increased. So why are women earning less? Well, they did have higher expenses. They are more focused on livestock, and the livestock farms in 2012 had high expenses because of drought. Costs for feeding animals was very high in 2012. So we're getting towards the end, and so we'll have time for some questions. Just a few highlights. Where are the women found? Well, the top farms, the top states for number of farms for women pretty match the top states for overall number of farms. Texas is by far the biggest farm state in terms of farms, but for women, California was the #1 state in terms of value of production for female-operated farms. And then some of the southeast states that tend to concentrate in poultry production. I think I'm going to skip through the next couple of slides in order that we could have more time to operate. One of the things that we've specially compiled is what are the exact crops that women are growing? What are their top commodities, top livestock items? And then if you really want more data, we have, I think the last census produced 6 million separate data points. That's all available on our website. And if you call us, you go to our helpline, you call me, you can find a lot of particular information. We also have specific information, not on our website, but on the USDA website as a whole, about how women participate in USDA programs, their participation rate by program. And you can compare that for women and men, women in different races and different ethnicities. So I think that pretty much ends my presentation. I hope we have some time for a little, for questions and for talk with Carolyn and Lyn too. I think Lyn will be presenting next.
Thank you so much, Ginger. That's a lot of great information that you were able to put together for us and go through, and we understand that it is a lot of information, and some of you may have some further questions, and it's just great that we have folks like Ginger who are there for us at the National Ag Statistics Service who can help us understand the data more and get more data for our regions and so forth if you have that interest. So a great resource, and thanks again for your presentation, Ginger. We will go next to Lyn, and then we'll come back and take questions from the audience. So if the audience would like to go ahead and enter more questions in, we'll try to get to as many of those questions as we can. Now, I'll turn it over to you, Lyn. Thanks for joining us and giving us some perspective on the U.S. Census of Ag from yourself as being a woman in agriculture.
Yes, hi everybody. Thanks for including me. My comments really come from just being the person who has to fill out these forms. I'm sitting in my farm office scratching my head when I get these forms. So from my point of view, I guess I was just, a lot of times these forms don't make much sense to me because most of the statistics that Ginger was talking about was derived in some way historically for some reason that I don't know. And a lot of times it focuses very much so on commodities. And there's so many of us, as her data show, that work in other aspects of agriculture. And when I got my first USDA loan, actually as being a, what do they call it, socially disadvantaged. I got a farm loan being a woman farmer, and that was called socially disadvantaged. So I mean, the language around these things and the forms you fill out are sometimes confusing when you're trying to be counted for something that you think is fairly simple. So from my point of view, I guess I just wanted to say that the definitions and the questions that are asked determines the answers, but sometimes maybe that doesn't fully characterize some of the things we may want to know at this point in history about what's happening in farming in general and women in specific. And so just to throw out a couple examples, I was always puzzled by the farm definition of something like $1,000 of gross income, including government payments. Well, you could have 15 chickens, and by my calculations, you could make $1,000 a year on 15 chickens. Does that mean you have a farm? Well, I'm not sure. And also, as Ginger mentioned earlier, how are these farmers actually being found? Because if you are on the regular census, this regular, U.S. Census, it no longer, my understanding is it no longer lists farming as an occupation. So if you're self-reporting, you wouldn't then report yourself as a farmer if you were maybe one of these smaller operators. So we may be possibly even overestimating what we would call farms if you're using $1,000 of gross income, that's not net, due to all these payments. Somebody with 2 chickens and an alpaca can be a farm, nothing against those things, but is that really helping us understand the demographic that we're trying to work with? So that was one of my sort of questions in general as I fill out these forms myself. Again, this self-reporting thing also makes me wonder if we're not fully characterizing the importance of women on farms and the types of work they do. I live in a neighborhood that's very traditional, like many farm communities, and specifically Amish. And the men and women that work on those farms basically do, well, they have a division of labor, but, they are like yin and yang in terms of holding that farm together. And so I'm just wondering about this self-identifying piece. If they choose to put themselves on, they're fine. If they don't find, if we don't find them, that kind of thing. So those are some questions I have. And then also, looking at the commodities, if you're defining the products on a farm, there's a real difference in overall effect economically, globally, locally, regionally, as to what types of crops are grown. So, for example, if we wanted to characterize the importance of women in a local food supply, let's say, maybe we wouldn't be able to get to that because they're sort of drowned out with everything that's included in a farm economy. So, for example, if you're a turf grower and you roll up turf and send it to golf courses or lawns, that's part of farming. So I guess I have questions about the actual commodities and what it means for food security in this country, like the role that women might be playing in supporting food security in this country, because separate from the statistics, we want to understand about our food system and women's role in it. And so, anyway, I'm just sort of throwing these off the top of my head, things that have occurred to me while I'm sitting there checking all the boxes that say other. Every time I get a census, I'm like da-da-da-da-da until I find the box other, and then I have to explain what I'm doing. So on our farm, we're very diverse. We're small. We make a lot more money than most of those ones that you showed on the graphs, but still, we're checking the box that means other. So we're not sure if we count, really, if we're always other. So some of these questions I think Ginger answered when she spoke about her slides. Before that, I had only just seen the slides. But what about that type and scale of food production, and I put food in bold, meaning actual food, because you can take something like a commodity that's got a lot of politics and a lot of money and a lot of global shenanigans going on around its pricing and where it goes and what it turns into. But when it comes back to actual food, in terms of our productive land in the United States and our population, what is the relationship between these data to food for people? And the economics of farming, I was struck, as I always am when I look at any data like this, the slide that Ginger showed that showed, oh gee, we made $100, we netted $100 less per farm than last year. Well, if we're only netting $4,000 a year, that's pitiful. And that, it has been pitiful for a long time, so what's up with the economics of farming, really seriously? And then farming as an entrepreneurial activity. Farming is really different probably from most entrepreneurial activities. And to what extent can we think of farms as entrepreneurial versus some other type of economy that involves, for better or worse, the albatross of land and paying for land around your neck? So, most of us who have small diversified farms, we're fairly entrepreneurial, I would say, but we still have to struggle with the disconnect between the sort of first world economy and what land is worth and what appears to be a third world economy of what we actually get back for our efforts on that land, even within the economy of the United States. So those are just my, back of the envelope as a farmer sitting at the table trying to fill out these forms. These are my questions, and I know these can't be like easily fill in the blank answered by the census, but I'm always struggling to use the information from the census in some useful way in terms of the programming we do for women farmers in our Women in Ag network, and also, you know, just going forward as a farmer, you're kind of, even with all these numbers, you're a little bit in the dark. Like, what does this actually tell me? I'm not sure. So those are my 2 cents.
Thank you, Lyn. Those are great questions, and we really appreciate your involvement in this webinar and bringing forth these questions, because as many folks are filling out those census forms, they have similar questions. So thanks for bringing these forward. I will turn it back to you, Ginger, to comment on these questions from Lyn before we go to our chat box and answer a few questions there.
You know, we have a lot of detailed data, and sometimes it's hard to pick out the piece. I mean, I think Lyn's right that one of the things that's concerning, if you look at overall for women, that, you know, $4,500 in net income, and that doesn't even include costs for land, capital costs for the operation. That's just basically cash flow. That's not enough to support a family. So how many women are there that are actually able to support a family with their farm income? We do collect data on a large variety of crops and livestock. Some of the data we present does have some fairly major categories, but we can separate out in particular, you know, smaller groups. If the data is not there that in the format you want, you can request a special tabulation of the data through our data lab. So if there's some particular thing you're interested in, one, you can call us, and maybe we've published it, you just can't find it. Or two, you do need it tabulated in a different way. We are in the process of producing county-level profiles of women farm operators. Those will be very useful for you at the local level. They're a little 2-page brochure that does tell you what size farms women are, what the top commodities are, and a little bit about the demographics at the county level. That could help in creating extension programs or for community-based organizations that work with women. What kind of programs are needed at that very local level?
Thank you, Ginger. It is complex, and it's astonishing to think about all of the data points that are collected, and yet there are still questions we don't know. There's decisions made about what gets collected, what doesn't get collected, and it's an imperfect system, and yet one that does provide very valuable information. And these things do change over time. So maybe, Lyn, to your point, as the census goes forward, you know, maybe they will be able to answer some of your questions as they go. But definitely a big challenge there. Ginger, I'd like to take you back to your slides in the pale orange boxes on women operators. And we did have a question actually from Lyn and Carolyn about the attribution of women principal operators due to age, since we know that many farmers in general, and certainly women farmers, are growing older. So what are your thoughts on that, and what can you say about the ages of women and the changes in the demographics?
Well, one of the things that's concerning all who look at agriculture is if we look just at the principal farm operator, in 2012 for women, 37% of all women were over 65. If we look at it for all farms, it was about 33%. So a substantial number of people involved in the sector are, you could say, of retirement age, but they're still working on their farms. Where are the young farm operators coming? Even if you look at the second and third operator, who in general tend to be younger, that group as a whole is still aging. It's not like if we just focus on the second and third, that the overall story, I don't think, would be substantially different. We can look at, you know, age. You know, we talked about the decline in the number of 75 years and older. Where are women finally going to retire? with the distribution of age, again, the second and third operators are younger, but it's not like the story is going to be all that different. If women are spouses of the principal operator, maybe they'll be a year or two younger, but they're not going to be 20 or 30 years younger in general, so we're missing all these young women. I don't know if that answered the question, or if Carolyn and Lyn would like to.
Sure, Carolyn or Lyn, did you have did that answer your question?
Yeah, I think that's fine.
Great. It's just a challenge to get to all of those stats. Well, we did have a question from Shannon in South Dakota about wondering, are women producing more niche products than men? And you spoke somewhat to this, Ginger, in pointing out that they more often have smaller operations. But what do you know about the niche products that they're producing?
Well, I'm a statistician, so I think I'm required, but I have, many different spreadsheets up on my computer at all these different times. But we do know women tend to operate a larger share of these specialty crops. If we're talking about, fruits and vegetables or a nursery greenhouse, we do know women have larger shares of farms in these categories. And also in the same is true of specialty livestock. Women do tend to have a greater share of farms that specialize in these productions. Again, women have fewer grain and oilseed farms, more fruit and vegetable farms, more horse farms, more specialty livestock. And so when we look at government programs, the old government programs for direct payments, a lot of those were for commodities, field crops, corn and soybeans. While women do grow those commodities, they, on average, are less likely to grow those than a male operator.
Very good. Thank you, Ginger. Rosemarie asked a question about the major economic downturn nationwide that occurred at a similar time as the 2007 and 2012 census, and she asked, what influence that had on farm businesses?
Well, it probably had a differential impact across the sectors. 2012, while it was, in the part of the downturn, it was also a period where grain and oilseed prices were very, very high, historically high. So farms that specialized in grain and oilseed production in 2012, if they had production, there was a big drought, they tended to do very well. Some of the other farmers, particularly those involved in a lot of the livestock production commodity areas, they had big problems because high grain and oilseed prices mean high costs for feeding animals. And there was a drought, so hay production was down. So there was a differential impact about it. One of the things that we saw in the 2012 census was there were fewer beginning farms. The economic downturn could have affected that. Land prices in agriculture were rising very rapidly over the period. So it was going to be more expensive to buy land to enter into agriculture. There was also less off-farm income as people lost jobs. A lot of off-farm income is used, you can't live on $4,500. The rest of your family's income is coming from something else. If off-farm jobs aren't there, you may not be able to afford your farm anymore.
Very, very good thoughts there, Ginger. Well, we are running out of time, folks, and I'm sorry we didn't get to quite all of the questions, but we may be able to type a few answers into the chat box, and if any of our guest speakers can answer those questions via the chat box, we would appreciate that. But I want to thank everybody for their attendance today and your interest. We are seeking to establish a National Women in Ag Learning Network, and with that, we hope to really connect with all of you, our audience, and we really want to hear from you about what kinds of information you're looking for, online courses, webinars, web content that we can provide. And one way you can tell us what you would like is by completing our surveys. And so if you have not yet had a chance to type your email into the chat box, if you're able to do that, we will send you a survey. The survey will help us get a little feedback on the webinar today, as well as give you an opportunity to tell us what you'd like to hear in the future. I also want to mention that our next webinar will be on Tuesday, December 16th with Angie Carter, Jenny Devine Barker, and Sarah Shepard. And they will be talking about women as the heart of the farm, why women's unique family and farm business roles matter. So we're all very much looking forward to that discussion, and we hope you can join us again on December 16th as well. So thanks again, everybody, for joining us. Have a great day, and we look forward to a continued network with all of you in the future. Thank you.